Good evening. It's about time for us to get started. If you'll open up your Bibles to John chapter 21 is where we're ready to begin. John chapter 21, as we slowly but surely draw to a close here in our study of John. We'll have this week and then next week, and that ought to wind it up. What is interesting, though, and we talked about this a little bit last week, when you get to the end of chapter 20, those last couple of verses, which I've told you, I don't know, it's been, I'm going to guess about it, I don't know if Glenn will remember, a year and a half ago maybe we started John. Of course, we were interrupted by the summer series, but he was 60, he said. I didn't think you were 60 now. Anyway, we've been in, but all the way back to the start, whenever that was, I was telling you that John 20, 30 through 31 is the purpose statement, where John just flat tells us this is the reason why that I'm writing this book. And when you read it, it sounds like what would be a perfect closing statement for a book, doesn't it? He's gone through all of these signs about Jesus up through this last sign, which is the most significant of all the signs, that Jesus was resurrected from the grave, and he's proven himself to be really Jesus and really alive after he was really dead. And he talks about with Thomas and the disciples that it's great that y'all see and believe, but even better are those who are going to believe without seeing. And then he adds this statement here, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples that are not written in this book, but these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ. And so it's almost like you would get to the end of some adventure book that you're reading, and it would say, you know, and Johnny and the crew had several more adventures through the years, and they lived happily ever. You know, that's what it kind of sounds like. It sounds like the perfect ending of the book. But then we get 25 more verses in chapter 21. And I think there's a significance for that, and we'll talk about that as we go through it. But what he has been doing all along is trying to prove to us that Jesus is the Christ so we can believe. And that's significant. Believe is used, 125 plus times. Jesus and Christ together are used about maybe 75 times, I think, maybe that believe is used, something like that. Jesus and Christ together are used about 125 times in the book. So he's trying to get us to believe that Jesus is the Christ. And he's proven that through the signs. But what do we do once we believe? That's really what chapter 21 is going to show us. Through Jesus' interactions that continue with these disciples, he's wanting them to see, and that's why what happens is Jesus needs them to see what they need to focus on moving forward, and that they are accepted and that they are saved and all of those types of things. But it's recorded so that we can have that confirmation. Jesus needs them to know that he still loves them and that he's with them and that he's in control. And one of the things you're going to notice as we go through chapter 21, all 25 verses just scream that Jesus is God and he's in control of everything that's going on. And he is. And so after this is the way it begins in verse 1 of chapter 21. After this was the events that he talks about. They've been in Jerusalem. Now in Acts he tells us that Jesus spent 40 days and 40 nights with his disciples after his resurrection. And so all of those events that took place, there's like a lot of things that you read about in the Bible. You study it and you read it and you're like, I wonder, you ever done that before? I wonder what happened with that or why that happened. But a lot of it we're not told about. But at some point they ended up back in Galilee, and that's where the events are going to take place that we're going to read about in chapter 21. Ultimately, before Jesus goes, he is ascended back into heaven, he's going to tell them to go to Jerusalem and to wait there until the Holy Spirit comes upon them. So They've been in Jerusalem. They're back in Galilee. They're eventually going to end up back down in Jerusalem again. And I'm sure that probably none of you read Matthew 28 today before you came to Bible study tonight, because we're not studying Matthew 28. You probably didn't read Matthew 28. But if you'd read Matthew 28, one of the things it said there is Jesus told them to go to Galilee and wait on a mountain for them. And we don't know what mountain that is. But they go and they wait and they wait and they wait. And after that time of waiting, it's like Peter, I don't know if he gets bored or he's frustrated or he feels like Jesus has just decided he didn't want him or what. But it says, after this, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he revealed himself in this way. Now, the Sea of Tiberias is the same as the Sea of Galilee. It's called the Sea of Tiberias because Tiberias was the most influential Roman-controlled city on the sea. Did y'all go to the city of Tiberias when y'all were in Israel? You did? Yeah, we did too, and it a really interesting place to see. But anyway, the Sea of Tiberias is the same as the Sea of Galilee. And John says, here's another time that Jesus revealed himself to us. This wasn't just like we saw him once, so that if, again, you think about this kind of a court crime scene description of what's going on in John, somebody that's a skeptic, the opposing lawyer might say, and how many times did you see him? Well, just once. So are you really sure it was him, or could it have been somebody else? Isn't it true that, Mary Magdalene didn't recognize him at first? Is it maybe possible you didn't recognize, but there was multiple times that they saw him. And so John says, here's yet another time that he revealed himself to us, and this is the way that happened. So he details in verse 2, Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples were together. So you had 12 disciples. Now we're left with 11 now that Judas is no longer part of the group. And we don't know where the rest of them are, but 7 of them are here. And the 7 that he talks about are actually, at least the 5 that we know who were, are 5 that were featured prominently in this gospel. So Simon Peter, who is always, in a listing of the disciples, is always the first one that is listed, and he's going to be really the focus in this chapter, really a contrast between Peter and John in this chapter. And then there's Thomas, who we just looked at in chapter 20. There's Nathanael that we saw back in chapter 1. There's the sons of Zebedee, which will be James and John, and then 2 other disciples, and we don't know who those would have been, but 2 of the others. But again, the point is that this isn't an isolated scene with one person. There's several witnesses to this. Okay? And Simon Peter said to them, I am going fishing. They said to him, we will go with you. Now, there's some that have suggested maybe that Simon was sinning in this, because if you'll recall, Jesus had told him that he would no longer catch fish, but he'd be a fisher of men. And the text doesn't indicate that he did. I mentioned, I don't remember if it was last week or a couple of weeks ago, but one of the interesting studies, I don't think it's a key word in the book, but it's an interesting study to follow the theme of the word go throughout John, and how people are going to where Jesus is, and they're going away from him, and they're going after him, and they're going to the other side to find him, and eventually they get frustrated and they go home, and Jesus, remember, asked the disciples, will you go away also? And Peter says, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. Well, here's another use of this word go, and it's Peter going fishing. And that's significant, I think, because who was Simon when Jesus called him to follow him? He was a fisherman. And so fishing is something that's comfortable to him. It's something that's easy for him. It's something that he probably feels like, is in his wheelhouse. This is something that I'm good at. Every indication that we would have up to this point, and every indication that we're going to have after this point in the gospel accounts, it doesn't seem like Peter's very comfortable in his skin with his relationship with Jesus and what's going on. And it seems to me, at least, and maybe I'm reading too much into the text, I don't know, but it seems to me like this is Peter saying, I wasn't really very good at this following Jesus stuff or this being an apostle. I wasn't very good at even keeping my word. Remember, he was the one that said, even if everybody else, I won't deny you. Even if it means being put to death, I would never deny you. And he denied him 3 times.
That's something I was just thinking about. That very thought right there. That maybe that's why it wasn't because after telling the Lord, I'll never deny you, and then he done it. Maybe part of it was shame.
Oh, it had to be. And especially when Jesus shows back up resurrected, that was not what he thought was going to happen, for sure. Yeah, so I'm going to go back and I'm going to do something that's comfortable, that I know I can't do this apostle stuff. I'm just not good at it. But you know what I can do? I can fish, right? And we also see the natural leader that Peter was, because when Peter said, I'm going fishing, what did the rest say? Now, this is not like Johnny stopping by at the office one day and say, hey, I'm going fishing, you want to go? Because for us, fishing would mean sitting by a bank or sitting in a boat, eating Little Debbie cakes and drinking Mountain Dew and talking and having a good time. This was work that they were doing, okay? They're not going because they're going to go have a good time. They're going because Peter's going, so we're going to go. And it shows what a negative influence that we can have sometimes with people as well, how he affected these others. So they went out and got in the boat, but that night they caught nothing. So they fish all night long, and that's significant. That's the way that they would fish. In fact, if you saw on social media today, this is the little advertisement thing that I put up about our class tonight, and this is from The Chosen, a scene from Peter out in the boat fishing, and this is the way that they would do that, is they would go out at night. And they went out and fished at night for 2 reasons. Number one, because you wanted to be able to go to the market first thing in the morning with fresh fish. Well, what's the only way to get to the market first thing in the morning with fresh fish? You got to fish at night. That's right. And the other thing is because you can see him doing it on this, they would take torches and hold it above the water. Sometimes they would put torches all around the boat, and those torches would actually draw the fish to them, that light. So it was a technique that would be useful for them to help them catch even more fish. So this seasoned, skilled fisherman, and he's got at least 2 other skilled fishermen with him as well, 2 of his old fishing partners, the sons of Zebedee. I don't know, but I would say that there's a pretty good chance that one of those 2 unnamed disciples might have been Andrew, but can't prove that. But they fish all night long. These men work hard all night long, and when they get to the end of the night, the first thing in the morning, what do they catch? Nothing. I looked up the Greek word there, and the Greek word means nothing. I mean absolutely nothing. 0. Have you ever... Now, this is going to be hard to get fishermen to tell the truth, but have you ever gone fishing and caught nothing? And the ones that are raising their hand, they're like, we don't want to, what do we usually say? Did you catch anything? If we didn't catch anything, we'll say, well, we had a bunch of bites, or something of that nature. It really is hard to go and not catch anything, though. Sometimes, we had a buddy of mine that we grew up fishing and hunting together, and he and his daddy had found this little watershed up in Paris called Five Fingers. I don't know if any of y'all have ever fished up there or not, but anyway, they went up there and they just caught a boatload of crappie. Well, that's as good as it gets to me as far as eating fish is crappie. And they caught 2 coolers full in like 2 hours, and we got to go. So me and him take off one day, and he said, I remember as we took off that morning heading toward Paris, I said, well, you think we're going to do good? He said, Corey, we're going to tear them up. Famous last words, you know. So we stopped at Country Corner and got 12 dozen minnows. And on the way home, we brought back 11 and a half dozen minnows and 3 little crappie. And so every other time we'd go fishing, he'd say something like, Corey, today I guarantee, and I'd say, don't you say it. Don't you try to guarantee nothing. They caught absolutely nothing. These skilled fishermen worked all night long and caught nothing. And just as the day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore, yet his disciples did not know that it was Jesus, which is interesting because, again, you remember Mary Magdalene, when she saw him at the grave, she didn't recognize that it was him. Now, in defense of the disciples here, it was early in the morning. Daylight was just breaking, so probably wasn't good light. The text tells us that they were about 100 yards from the shore, and 100 yards from the shore, you probably couldn't see great detail just with the light just breaking. But at the same time, for the most part, like if you know somebody, can't you see somebody from a great distance and say, that looks like, right? That looks like Johnny Shanklin over there. I think that's Matt Valley walking over, you know what? But they don't even recognize him at all. And again, I'm not sure, we talked about last week a little bit about our resurrected body and how 1 Corinthians 15 talks about it's going to be different. I don't know what that exactly is like. I wish I could tell you more about that, but I can't. You can read 1 Corinthians 15 and it'll tell you a lot of things, but it doesn't tell you really the details of what it's going to be like. But, you know, usually people will ask the question, are we going to know each other in heaven? And I do believe that we'll know each other in heaven. I don't know how that happens. I know that they recognized Moses and Elijah. I don't know why that quit connecting there. There we go. I know they recognized Moses and Elijah on the Mount of Transfiguration. I know that you know they know it's Jesus eventually. I don't know. I'm not sure. It's just going to be hard to get along with, so we'll just do it that way. For whatever reason, they don't recognize him at first. But Jesus says to them, children, do you have any fish? And they answered no. So he asked them this question, do you have any fish? They're in a fishing boat. That'd be a normal question to ask somebody out in a fishing boat. If you've ever been fishing out in a boat in a lake, you get next near to somebody else, and what do you ask them? Y'all caught anything? You know, and they said no, we hadn't. They've caught absolutely nothing. Well, he says to them, cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you'll find some. And I wrote there, I've got it in my Bible, fish finder. Jesus would be the best fish finder you could ever have in your boat, wouldn't he? Because he'd know all about it. But here's the interesting thing about that is the boats that they were fishing in, because they found one. I know y'all saw this when you went to Israel. They found a boat from 2,000 years ago, the time of Jesus, that was a fishing boat. And it's 27 feet long, and it's 7.5 feet wide. So, if I was fishing at Kentucky Lake, and I'm fishing up by the docks, and I'm on the west side of the lake, you know, and I see Johnny coming back in, and he's got a cooler full of fish. And if you go over the east side of the lake, that's where they're at. Well, all right, I'll go over there and try that. If Johnny said you missed them by 7.5 feet, I'd probably slap Johnny, you know. He says you need to move your line 7.5 feet. Well, what's 7.5 feet? A fish will move that far. Jesus is literally telling them, you move your net 7.5 feet and you'll catch fish. And it may have been even that they thought that was ridiculous, but they did it anyway. It says, so they cast it, And now they were not able to haul it in because of the quantity of fish. Now, why is this all happening? This is a miracle, obviously. But why would this all be happening? You've got men that, are they competent? Oh yeah, they're fishermen, professional fishermen, right? Are they diligent? Yeah, they fished how long? All night long. But you know, we can be competent and we can be diligent, but if we're not obedient, are we going to be successful? We're not. They needed to know that, didn't they? They needed to learn that you can be competent and you can be diligent, but if you're not obedient to what the Lord says, you're never going to be successful in the work and the mission that I'm sending you out to do. Right? Are you with me? That's a lesson that we've got to learn. I can be competent and I can work hard, but if I don't do what God tells me to do, the way He tells me to do it, am I going to be really successful? Absolutely not. And God's people needed to know that at this point, and God's people need to know that at this point, don't we? And so when they were obedient, they brought in so many fish that they couldn't pull the net in the boat. And then that disciple whom Jesus loved, and we've talked about this a bunch throughout the gospel. Who's that? That's John, and we've talked about maybe it was his humility that caused him to write that way. It's interesting because, and maybe we talked about this before, any one of the disciples could have been described that way, couldn't they? Was Peter a disciple whom Jesus loved? Was Andrew a disciple whom Jesus loved? I'm a disciple that Jesus loves, right? You're a disciple that Jesus loves. But it's almost like John doesn't want you to focus on him throughout this gospel. I want you to know, here's the one thing that I really know about Jesus. He loves me. See. Did they need to know that right now? Absolutely. So that disciple whom Jesus loved, therefore, said to Peter, "It's the Lord." Now, what would make John realize when they can't get the fish in the boat that it's the Lord? It's happened before. When did it happen before? In Luke chapter 5 is when it happened before, when Jesus is looking for a place to, he got the crowds are pushing in on him, you remember? And he gets in Peter's boat and he preaches to them, and they've been fishing all night long, and he tells them, put your net on the other side. And one of the things that I love the most about the gospel, I think it's funny, it's what I think. I love it when Jesus gives fishermen advice on how to fish. Isn't that funny? Because Jesus was a fisherman. Jesus was some sort of a carpenter or stonemason or something of that, a tradesman. Whenever I'd set tombstones, there was a guy one time, it was hot as blue blazes, and I had a pickaxe trying to break hard ground so I could pour a footing, and there was about an 85-year-old man that every move that I made, he had a better way that I could do that. And I finally kind of borrowed a line from Andy Griffith, and I told him, I said, "Listen, sir," I said, "people come from, when it comes to setting tombstones, people come from miles around to watch me do it. I know exactly what I'm doing." You know, and anyway, Andy said that about planting petunias. But anyway, here you got professional fishermen. Now, I don't think, I may be wrong, I don't think that if I showed up on a job site and said, "Bubba, let me tell you the real way to put up a structure," Bubba would say, "You don't know, you've not built anywhere." I built some birdhouses. They were quality birdhouses, Bubba. But he'd probably say, "You need to know what you're good at and what I'm good at," right? If I went to the bank and told Jeff, here's the way you need to run this bank, Jeff would say, "I've been running a bank for a long time. I've been in banking for a long time. I know what I'm doing." Jesus is telling these fishermen how to fish because Jesus could tell a physicist the better way to be a physicist or whatever it might be. But he tells them put it on the other side, and they in Luke chapter 5. They bring in so many fish that it nearly sinks the boat. Well, John is looking around at what's going on here, and he's like, wait a minute. Hey, this is like deja vu all over again, you know. I remember something like this happening once before. A couple of years ago, me and my brother was over in our boat, and we saw what happened in Peter and Andrew's boat. We had to go over there and help them get all the fish before their boat sank. There's only one person that could be. It's got to be Jesus. And so when Peter heard that, it was the Lord. He put on his outer garment, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea. Now, this is another portion of a verse that I think is hilarious. They had taken off their outer garments. They're working in their inner garments or underwear, we would basically say, but it would be like it would go from the knees up like a shirt, kind of shorts combo together. He would have been working in. And before he swims, he puts on his outer coat. Now, why would you do that? All right. If you're going to jump in the water, would you put on a cotton quarter zip? Would that make you warmer in the water? It'd drag you down into the water, wouldn't it? It really don't make any sense. But I think this really just shows us Peter. Is Peter known at this point for being the one that really thinks things through? He puts on his coat and he jumps off in the water and he swims to Jesus. He's so excited to see him. And then the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, about 100 yards off. Now, here again, we think that it's all about us providing what we need. They had to know that it was really God providing for them. As they go forward in their ministries, they need to realize that it's not about them. It's not about their competency. It's not about their diligence. It's not about their talent. It's about the Lord. And we sometimes get caught up into thinking about, I've got to do this and what I've got to do, and we've got to recognize it's not us, it's Him, see. Stepping out in faith and trusting in Him. And then giving Him the glory when things happen. You know, when I talk to people in other places and they'll say, man, it sounds like you are growing. What are you doing down there? And I'll say, it's the Lord. That's all I can say. It's the Lord. And they needed to understand that, because they're going to have flaws and they're going to have deficiencies, but it's not about them. It's about God. It's not about how competent they were, about how diligent they were. It's about doing what God says. So when they got out on land, they saw a charcoal fire in place with fish laid out on it and bread. All right, a couple of things. When's the last time we saw a charcoal fire in the book of John? Do you remember? Who was warming their hands? And what did Peter do at that charcoal fire? He denied Jesus. In fact, it's the only other time you see a charcoal fire mentioned in the Gospel of John. I think that's significant, because he denied Him how many times? And around this charcoal fire, he's going to have a time to confirm his faith in Jesus 3 times. The other thing that's significant is, Jesus asked, do you have any fish? Their answer was no. He tells them how they can catch some fish, and when they get through dragging the fish up on the bank, when they get there, what's Jesus already got on the fire? Where'd that come from? Did He need their fish? Because He's Jesus, right? There's already fish on the fire. So Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish you've just caught. So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore full of large fish. Now this sounds like a fisherman telling a story, doesn't it? They weren't just fish. They were large fish, right? 153 of them. Now why in the world would he say there's 153? And your silence is the right answer. We don't know, because the text doesn't tell us. There's an ancient writer named Jerome that talks about that at this point in world history, there was 153 varieties of fish on the earth, and this was representative of the fact that they were supposed to spread the gospel to everybody, and that sounds good. Maybe it's the truth, I don't know, but there's nothing in the text that really ties us to that. I think this is just another one of those, you don't tell details when you're lying, do you? You want to be vague. And here's another detail. And I don't know if maybe that's just the way they normally worked. When these fishermen got to the shore with their morning's catch, first thing they did was count them so they could bring them into the market. I don't know, but here's another one of those details that John throws in for us, and that there were 153 fish, and although there were so many, the net was not torn. And the implication that John is making here is that with 153 very large fish, that net shouldn't have held it. But again, it wasn't about their competency, it wasn't about their diligence, it wasn't about their aptitude, it wasn't anything about how good a material that they were working with. This was all about Jesus providing for them. Jesus is in control of this whole situation. You're going fishing because you want to go where you're comfortable. And the only way you're really going to be comfortable is if you do what I'm telling you need to do, see, to abide in my will. So Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" And why did they not ask him, "Who are you?" Because now they knew it was the Lord. And we've talked about before, there's different kinds of know. There's the intellectual knowledge and there's the experiential knowledge. This is the intellectual knowledge. They didn't know this was Jesus because of what they experienced. They know it's Jesus because they know who Jesus is, and I can look at him and say, this is my daddy. This is my mama. This is Johnny Shanklin. I just know that's who it is. They know that it's Jesus. He's really here and He's really alive. So Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and so with the fish, which again had to make them think back to the feeding of the 5,000 in John chapter 6. And then he says this was now the third time that Jesus was revealed to the disciples after He was raised from the dead. He first showed Himself to Mary Magdalene, but then the other 3 times was with the 10. The second time was with Thomas there with the 10, and now this is the third time that Jesus has revealed Himself to the disciples. And again, you would think at the end of chapter 20 we're done, but Jesus is needing them to understand that it's important to believe, and that belief is what causes us to have life, but it's about following Him. And when we get into the last half of this chapter next week and wind it up, you're going to notice that idea of following is really going to be important. But at first, before we're going to follow Jesus, we got to understand that it's all about Him. It's not about me. It's all about Him. That not only is He resurrected and not only is He alive, He's God. And He's in control of all of this. And He's the one that's going to provide what we need. And He's the one that's going to make sure that we're successful. And He's the one that we can count on and depend on with what we're going forward and doing. It's not about us, because they can look at themselves and they can say, I failed. And can't we all do that? We can look at ourselves and see, times that we've messed up and we've let ourselves down or let the Lord down or let our family down or whatever it might be. But it's not about you and how good you are and how proficient you are, how hardworking you are. It's, are you willing to let God use you? Because when we allow Him to use us, then we can become so much more than we ever would. Were it not for John chapter 21, the last scene that we would have had of Peter really is Peter being the one that denies Jesus. He's a failure, right? And even when they get to the tomb, Mary comes and tells them the news, and they run. And of course, They had the resurrection marathon, and John tells us a couple of times that he beat Peter, you know. Peter gets down to the tomb, and Peter looks in, and he's confused, right? John is the one that at the tomb figured out what was going on, and he believed that it was Jesus. John is the one that figured out here that it's Jesus. And knowing it's Jesus, that we can trust Him. And knowing it's Jesus, realize that He'll provide what we need. Does that make sense? All right, so we're going to really contrast John and Peter when we get into this next section and this conversation that Jesus is going to have with Peter. And one of the many things that is unique to John from the other Gospels is this conversation that is a really, really cool conversation. So if you would, over the course of the next week, read the rest of this chapter and see what you notice about in it. I can also tell you, Gordon, I tried to tell him he was going to teach next week, but he wouldn't listen to me. So Gordon actually preached a sermon one time on this last half of John 21 that I think is one of the best sermons I've ever heard him preach. So if you can dig that up online somewhere, you'll enjoy listening to him preach about that. But it's maybe my favorite account in John, and it's one that's unique to John. So we'll study that next week, and we'll wrap up the gospel, and then we'll talk about what it is that we're going to do next. As we're getting everything turned off, Nathan's getting those that are online shut down. I want you to know, those of you online, we're glad you're with us and hope you can be with us in person very soon. For those of you that are here in person, we have a few announcements that we want to make you aware